The best moment in a man's life is when he finally realizes that his happiness does not depend on anybody else. Every man has a breaking point, and it's the moment his entire life shifts for the better. Not because he stops loving his family, not because he becomes selfish, but because he finally wakes up. Most men tie their identity to being needed, but that pressure destroys them silently. A good man spends years carrying everybody else, his kids, his partner, his parents, but the same man often forgets the only person he can't replace, himself. And then life hits him hard, a betrayal, the loss of a child, a divorce, bankruptcy, a collapse that shakes his entire sense of worth. But then something clicks. The question changes. It stops being, what do I need to do for everybody else? And it becomes, what am I doing for myself? That is the moment a man stops surviving and starts rebuilding. He invests in himself, his health, his future, his mission, his mind, and his peace. Because now he understands the truth that most men never get to learn. If his happiness depends on anybody else, he's fragile. If that person leaves or if the job disappears, his entire world falls with it. But once he chooses himself, he becomes unshakable. So if you see a man suddenly focusing on his goals, his routine, and his purpose, don't panic. He's not pulling away from you. He's pulling himself out of the life he built on fear. He's no longer with somebody because he needs them. He is with somebody because he chooses to be with them, because he's finally building a happiness that comes from within. There's a big difference between a man who needs a woman and a man who chooses to be with one. One is dependency, the other is power. When a man learns how to create his own peace, his own stability, his own identity, he brings a love that is grounded, steady, and intentional. A love that is not born from fear or losing somebody, but from strength and knowing exactly who he is without them. And that's when a man becomes dangerous in the best possible way, because he finally knows his own worth. Be dangerous.
Something profound is happening beneath the surface of modern society, and most people are only now beginning to notice it. Entire systems are straining, costs are rising, labor is disappearing, and cultural narratives that once felt permanent are quietly unraveling. This video is not about outrage or bitterness. It is about observation, pattern recognition, and the consequences of long-term choices that were ignored for decades. Stay with me until the end, because once you see the full picture, it becomes impossible to unsee. If you find value in content like this, take a moment to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. These discussions matter, and the algorithm only pushes them when people actively support them. Before we go further, I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy. If you are serious about protecting and safeguarding your assets and learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, the Academy is designed to help you do exactly that. The link is in the description of this video, so take a moment and check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to keep the content coming, and it is always appreciated. Now let us begin. For most of modern history, societies have been built on an unspoken understanding about contribution and responsibility. People worked, people produced, people maintained systems, and in return, they were offered stability, meaning, and a place within the broader structure. When that understanding is broken for long enough, the response is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes the response is quiet withdrawal. Sometimes it is disengagement. Sometimes it is simply walking away. Right now, tens of millions of working-age men are no longer participating in the workforce or in traditional social structures at the levels they once did. This is not a temporary fluctuation or a short-term trend. It is a long-term behavioral shift that has been building for decades and has now reached a scale that can no longer be ignored. In the United States alone, roughly 50 million working-age men have effectively checked out of full participation. And similar patterns are emerging across Europe, the United Kingdom, Japan, and other developed nations. This matters because men historically make up the majority of labor in infrastructure, logistics, skilled trades, maintenance, and systems that keep modern life functioning. Men also pay the majority of total tax revenue, while women account for the majority of consumer spending. That arrangement functioned as long as participation remained stable on both sides. Once one side disengages, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Society is now discovering what happens when the people who produce, build, maintain, and fund systems decide that the cost of participation outweighs the benefits. Shortages are appearing everywhere. Skilled labor gaps are widening. Essential services are harder to staff. Entire industries are struggling to replace experience that walked away and never returned. The common explanation offered by media and institutions is that this is a loneliness crisis among men. That framing sounds compassionate, but it misses the core reality. Many men are not withdrawing because they feel alone. They are withdrawing because they feel unvalued, replaceable, and exploited. There is a difference between being alone and feeling at peace, and many men have learned that difference the hard way. At the same time, a very different kind of distress is becoming visible across social platforms. Young women are increasingly vocal about financial stress, rising living costs, difficulty forming relationships, and the absence of traditional support systems they once assumed would always be there. They are expressing confusion about why dating feels harder, why men are no longer approaching, why social dynamics have shifted so abruptly. What is happening is not sudden, it is delayed feedback. For decades, men were told explicitly and implicitly that they were not needed, that their contributions were problematic, that their presence was conditional, and that their value existed only in what they could provide. Many accepted this messaging because they were taught that sacrifice equaled virtue and that endurance equaled love. Over time, that lesson stopped making sense. Men began to notice that expectations were one directional: provide stability, provide resources, provide protection, provide attention. Do not expect appreciation. Do not expect reciprocity. Do not expect loyalty. When problems arose, take responsibility. When success occurred, step aside. When boundaries were enforced, be labeled difficult or outdated. Eventually, enough men recognized the pattern. Walking away was not an act of anger, it was an act of clarity. Men discovered that they could live with far less than they were told they needed. They learned that peace did not require constant validation. They realized that many pressures placed upon them were optional once they stopped chasing approval. Minimalism became not a trend, but a survival strategy. Smaller spaces, fewer obligations, lower expenses, less noise, more control. This shift collided directly with an economic environment that is becoming increasingly hostile to single earners. High housing costs, rising food prices, inflation, and stagnant wages have made independence difficult for many people. But the impact is not evenly distributed. Men, on average, adapt more easily to minimalist living. Women, on average, face greater difficulty maintaining lifestyle expectations without shared financial support. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observable reality. For years, cultural messaging encouraged women to prioritize careers above family formation, to delay long term planning, and to rely on institutional support structures as a substitute for partnership. That strategy appeared viable during periods of economic expansion and easy credit. It becomes far less viable during contraction, inflation, and systemic strain. As institutional support weakens and costs rise, the fallback option that quietly existed in the background begins to disappear. Men are no longer automatically available as a safety net. They are no longer eager to absorb financial pressure, emotional labor, and social risk without clear benefit. This realization is jarring for a society that assumed male participation was permanent and unconditional. Men, on the other hand, are adapting quickly. They are conserving resources. They are opting out of unnecessary conflict. They are choosing solitude over instability. They are investing in themselves rather than systems that have shown no loyalty to them. This is why the conversation feels so disconnected. One side is asking where everyone went. The other side already answered years ago and moved on. What many men have internalized is that observable behavior matters more than stated intent. They learn to trust patterns rather than promises. When told repeatedly to step back, they eventually did. When told they were not essential, they stopped acting essential. When told they were replaceable, they replaced the system instead. The result is a growing skills gap that cannot be solved overnight. Plumbing, electrical work, machining, construction, logistics, sanitation, and infrastructure all require experience that cannot be automated away easily. Training pipelines take years to mature, and the incentive to enter these fields diminishes when social respect and long term stability are absent. This is the cost of discouraging participation without understanding who actually keeps things running. Men walking away does not look dramatic on the surface. It looks like fewer applications, fewer volunteers, fewer long hours, less enthusiasm, less engagement. Over time, those small changes compound into systemic fragility. At the same time, men who have stepped back are not suffering in the way many expected. They are sleeping more, spending less, stressing less. They are no longer measuring their worth through external validation. They are building lives scaled to their actual needs rather than inflated expectations. They are discovering that simplicity is a form of freedom. And this does not mean all men are thriving or that all women are struggling. It means the average experience is shifting in ways that challenge old assumptions. Systems built on one group carrying disproportionate burden eventually collapse when that group withdraws consent. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. What we are witnessing is not a crisis of masculinity or femininity. It is a crisis of incentives. People respond rationally to the environment they are placed in. When contribution is punished and withdrawal is peaceful, withdrawal becomes logical. When cooperation offers diminishing returns, independence becomes attractive. The cultural conversation has been slow to catch up because it requires admitting that certain narratives were incomplete. It requires acknowledging that telling an entire group they are unnecessary eventually produces exactly that outcome. Men did not vanish overnight. They were pushed to the margins, one message at a time. Now, society is noticing the absence, not because of ideology, but because the practical consequences are unavoidable. Systems need participants, economies need producers, stability requires balance. The question is not whether men will return. The question is whether the environment they left behind is capable of changing enough to make return desirable. So far, the evidence suggests that many men are content where they are. They have recalibrated expectations. They have accepted trade offs. They have learned that peace is not found in chasing approval, but in aligning life with reality. As this trend continues, the gap between those who adapted early and those still waiting for old systems to resume will widen. The world is not reverting to what it was. It is moving forward into something leaner, quieter, and less forgiving of illusions. Understanding the shift is essential because it explains labor shortages, social tension, economic stress, and the growing disconnect between messaging and lived experience. It explains why certain conversations feel circular and why proposed solutions miss the mark. This is not about blame, it is about cause and effect. When incentives change, behavior follows. And right now, the incentives that once held everything together no longer exist. As this shift continues, one of the most misunderstood aspects is motivation. Many assume men withdrew because they failed, because they could not keep up, or because they lacked resilience. That assumption is comforting for institutions because it places responsibility on individuals rather than on systems. The reality is far less convenient. Many of the men who stepped away were capable, productive, and skilled. They did not leave because they could not succeed. They left because success no longer felt meaningful under the conditions imposed upon them. When effort is met with suspicion rather than appreciation, motivation erodes. When responsibility is demanded without authority or respect, disengagement becomes inevitable. Men were expected to contribute endlessly while being told that their contributions were inherently flawed. Over time, this contradiction became impossible to ignore. The modern narrative insisted that men needed to be reshaped, corrected, and managed, yet still relied on them to shoulder risk, labor, and responsibility. That arrangement was never sustainable. People do not willingly sacrifice for systems that openly resent them. What followed was not rebellion, but resignation. Men began opting out of social expectations that offered diminishing returns. Dating became transactional and adversarial rather than cooperative. Work became a grind rather than a path to stability. Public spaces became hostile rather than welcoming. The logical response was to reduce exposure. This is why so many men now prioritize quiet routines, low cost living, and minimal obligations. They are not hiding, they are optimizing. They are building lives that cannot be easily disrupted because they no longer depend on approval from institutions or social validation. This shift also exposes a deeper truth about modern economies. They were designed around constant expansion, rising consumption, and ever increasing participation. When a significant portion of contributors decides to scale down instead of scaling up, the entire model strains. Consumption slows, tax bases shrink, labor shortages grow. Governments respond with messaging rather than solutions because solutions would require addressing why participation declined in the first place. Instead of asking what went wrong, institutions ask how to incentivize men to return without changing the environment that drove them away. That approach fails because it misunderstands the nature of the withdrawal. This is not a temporary pause, it is a reevaluation of priorities. Men are not waiting for permission to re-enter. They are deciding whether re-entry makes sense at all. This becomes especially clear when examining how men and women experience financial stress differently. When economic pressure increases, men tend to reduce needs. Women tend to seek increased support. Neither response is inherently wrong, but the outcomes diverge sharply when support structures fail. Men adapt inward, women adapt outward. As inflation rises and living costs climb, reliance on external systems becomes risky. The state cannot provide indefinitely. Debt has limits. Credit has consequences. When these supports weaken, those who built independence earlier fare better than those who assumed stability was guaranteed. This is why social media increasingly reflects frustration and confusion. Expectations formed during one economic era are colliding with the realities of another. Men adjusted earlier because they were forced to. Women are adjusting later because they were encouraged to delay. The result is not hostility but misalignment. Men learned self sufficiency because dependence was punished. Women learned independence because dependence was discouraged. Now both are facing a world where collaboration would be beneficial, yet trust has eroded. Trust is the missing variable in this conversation. Men stop trusting social systems that frame them as problems. Women stop trusting men because they were told men were unreliable or unnecessary. Each side internalized messages that undermined cooperation. Once trust disappears, people default to self preservation. Men realized that they could meet their own needs with fewer resources than they were taught. They simplified life not because they lacked ambition, but because ambition without security is exhausting. They chose predictability over chaos. They chose peace over constant negotiation. This is why many men appear calm while systems around them show stress. They are no longer emotionally invested in outcomes they cannot control. They are no longer chasing approval from structures that offer none. From the outside, this looks like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like relief. Meanwhile, institutions are struggling to replace what was lost. Skilled labor cannot be summoned by slogans. Experience cannot be generated overnight. Commitment cannot be coerced. You cannot shame people into caring. This is why recruitment campaigns fail, why participation incentives fall flat, and why messaging grows increasingly desperate. The underlying issue remains unaddressed because addressing it would require acknowledging that long term messaging choices had unintended consequences. When people are told repeatedly that they are unwanted, eventually they believe it. When they are told they are unnecessary, eventually they act unnecessary. When they are told to step aside, eventually they leave the room entirely. Now the silence is loud. Another overlooked aspect is how technology accelerated the shift. Remote work, automation, digital entertainment, and online communities allowed men to withdraw without social isolation. They could meet needs digitally, work intermittently, and maintain routines without constant exposure to hostile environments. Technology made opting out feasible. In previous generations, withdrawal meant poverty or exclusion. Today, it often means downsizing rather than disappearing. Men can live smaller without living worse. This further reduces pressure to re engage with systems that feel antagonistic. At the same time, cultural expectations around relationships did not adapt. Many still assume men should pursue, provide, and absorb risk by default. But those assumptions no longer align with male incentives. Men now evaluate interactions through cost benefit analysis rather than obligation. If the cost exceeds the benefit, they walk away. This is not cruelty, it is rational behavior in an environment that penalizes vulnerability. As a result, social dynamics shift quietly. Fewer approaches, fewer commitments, fewer long term plans involving shared resources. Men choose optionality over entanglement. This creates anxiety for those who expected traditional patterns to persist indefinitely. It feels like disappearance because it is disappearance from old roles, not from existence. And men did not vanish, they changed lanes. The economic implications of this are significant. Systems built on the assumption of unlimited male participation are discovering bottlenecks everywhere. When fewer men compete, wages rise in some sectors, but productivity falls overall. When fewer men consume, growth slows. When fewer men commit, long term planning becomes harder. This forces institutions into a dilemma. They can either adapt by rebuilding trust and offering genuine reciprocity, or they can attempt to manage decline through control and messaging. So far, messaging has dominated, but messaging cannot substitute for respect. Respect is not demanded, it is earned through consistent action. When men saw that their sacrifices were taken for granted and their concerns dismissed, respect eroded. Once lost, it is difficult to restore. This is why calls for men to return often fall flat. They are framed as obligations rather than invitations. They appeal to guilt rather than opportunity. They promise responsibility without reward. Men recognize this instantly. They already lived that life. Another critical factor is generational learning. Younger men watched older men navigate systems that offered diminishing returns. They observed outcomes rather than intentions. They adjusted earlier. This is why disengagement is accelerating. Lessons are being passed down informally through observation. You do not need ideology when reality teaches the lesson clearly. Work harder does not always mean live better. Commitment does not always mean security. Sacrifice does not always mean appreciation. Once these lessons become widely accepted, behavior shifts en masse. This is not pessimism, it is realism. Men are not organizing, they are not coordinating, they are independently reaching the same conclusions based on shared experiences. That is why the movement feels invisible. There is no leader, no manifesto, no headquarters. There is simply alignment of incentives. Alignment is powerful because it does not require enforcement. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Habits form, lifestyles stabilize, expectations reset. Men who have adapted no longer feel deprived, they feel unburdened. Reintroducing old pressures into a simplified life feels unnecessary rather than appealing. This is the challenge society faces. You cannot easily persuade someone to give up peace for stress or freedom for obligation without offering something genuinely better. So far, that offer has not materialized. Instead, blame circulates. Labels replace analysis. Simplistic explanations are repeated because complex truths are uncomfortable. But the patterns remain. Men walking away did not collapse society overnight. It revealed weaknesses that already existed. It exposed dependencies that were never acknowledged. It forced conversations that were postponed for decades. What comes next depends on whether systems adapt honestly or double down defensively. If trust can be rebuilt, cooperation can return in new forms. If not, disengagement will continue quietly, steadily, and without drama. Men will keep choosing lives that fit their values rather than values imposed upon them. And the world will continue adjusting to that reality whether it wants to or not. As more time passes, the scale of the shift becomes harder to dismiss because its effects ripple outward into every layer of society. What once appeared as isolated personal choices now reveals itself as a collective adjustment to incentives that no longer reward participation. Systems that depended on silent compliance are discovering that compliance was never guaranteed, it was conditional. One of the conditions that quietly disappeared was mutual respect. Respect is not ceremonial language or public messaging. Respect is reflected in outcomes, fairness, and consistency. When men saw that rules were applied unevenly and accountability flowed in only one direction, trust eroded. Without trust, obligation feels like exploitation rather than cooperation. This erosion did not happen overnight, it accumulated through countless small signals. Workplace policies that treated men as liabilities rather than contributors. Social norms that framed male initiative as suspicious rather than valuable. Cultural narratives that portrayed responsibility as guilt and restraint as weakness. Each signal alone was manageable. Together, they reshaped perception, and men noticed that no matter how carefully they behaved, the risk remained. Misinterpretation carried consequences. Silence was safer than engagement. Distance was safer than proximity. Over time, avoidance replaced participation, not because men lacked confidence, but because confidence no longer reduced risk. This recalibration changed how men approached every area of life. Work became transactional rather than aspirational. Relationships became optional rather than central. Community involvement became selective rather than automatic. Men stopped volunteering emotional energy where the return was uncertain. Critically, this was not driven by ideology, it was driven by experience. Men did not need to be convinced to step back. They needed to be convinced that stepping forward was worth it, and that argument was never made convincingly. As this pattern spread, younger generations observed and adapted even earlier. They entered adulthood already skeptical of narratives that promise fulfillment through sacrifice alone. They asked practical questions instead of accepting inherited expectations. What does this cost? What does this return? What happens if it fails? These questions were once discouraged as selfish. Now they are survival tools. Men realized that living smaller did not mean living worse. It meant living within controllable boundaries. Fewer dependencies meant fewer vulnerabilities. Fewer expectations meant fewer disappointments. Stability replaced ambition as the primary goal. This shift has profound implications for social planning. Institutions rely on predictable behavior to function. When behavior becomes unpredictable, planning fails. Retirement systems strain. Housing markets wobble. Labor forecasts miss targets. Policymakers scramble to explain outcomes they did not anticipate. Yet the cause remains straightforward. Participation declined because the perceived value of participation declined. Rather than addressing this directly, many institutions respond by reframing disengagement as a problem to be fixed rather than a message to be understood. Campaigns encourage men to return without acknowledging why they left. Initiatives promote inclusion without addressing exclusion that already occurred. The disconnect persists. Men interpret this as further confirmation that their experiences are irrelevant to decision makers. The response is continued withdrawal. Another factor accelerating this trend is the normalization of solitude. For generations, solitude was portrayed as failure. Social success was defined externally. Relationships, status, and visibility were treated as measures of worth. Men internalized these standards until they realized the cost. Solitude, when chosen, is not loneliness, it is autonomy. It allows reflection without interruption. It reduces noise. It creates space for clarity. Men discovered that many pressures dissolved once they stopped measuring themselves through others. This realization is quietly transformative. It changes priorities permanently. Once a person learns they can be content with less, they become difficult to manipulate with promises of more. Advertising loses power. Social pressure weakens. Fear based motivation fails. This is why consumption patterns are changing. Men who once spent heavily to signal success now prioritize durability over display. They invest in tools, skills, and experiences that increase independence rather than validation. This shift undermines economic models built on aspiration rather than necessity. When aspiration fades, demand softens. Entire industries feel the impact. At the same time, women navigating rising costs encounter a different challenge. Systems encourage reliance on growth and external support. When growth stalls and support weakens, adaptation becomes urgent. The resulting stress is real, but it emerges later because the signals were delayed. This timing mismatch creates frustration on both sides. Men feel misunderstood for adapting early. Women feel blindsided by changes they were told would never happen. Each side believes the other abandoned the agreement because the agreement itself was never clearly defined. The reality is that the agreement was informal and asymmetrical. Men were expected to provide stability. Women were expected to pursue fulfillment. When fulfillment proved unstable, the imbalance became obvious. Men had already adjusted, women are adjusting now. This adjustment phase is emotionally charged because it involves letting go of assumptions. Assumptions about permanence, assumptions about roles, assumptions about who carries responsibility when systems falter. The most uncomfortable realization is that no one is obligated to sacrifice indefinitely. Obligation requires consent, and consent can be withdrawn. Men withdrew consent quietly. This is why anger is not the defining emotion of this shift. Indifference emerges when people stop expecting fairness. It is not loud. It does not protest. It simply disengages. Indifference is difficult for systems to confront because it cannot be argued with. You cannot shame someone into caring. You cannot threaten someone who already accepts loss. This is the power of minimalism. When people need little, they fear little. Men who scaled down discovered resilience. They can absorb shocks without collapsing. They can adapt quickly because their lives are not overextended. They are less dependent on institutions and more tolerant of uncertainty. This makes them harder to mobilize for causes that offer abstract rewards. Appeals to duty fall flat when duty was never reciprocated. Institutions often misinterpret this as apathy. It is not apathy, it is selectivity. Men are choosing where to invest energy carefully because energy is finite. This selectivity extends to social interaction. Men no longer pursue by default. They observe first. They wait for reciprocity. If none appears, they move on without confrontation. This behavior is frequently misread as disengagement or avoidance. In reality, it is boundary enforcement, and boundaries are not hostility, they are clarity. When boundaries become widespread, social norms shift. Expectations adjust slowly at first, then rapidly once tipping points are reached. We are approaching such a tipping point. Labor markets already show strain. Infrastructure projects stall. Skilled trades struggle to recruit. Experience gaps widen. These are not short term disruptions, they are structural consequences of disengagement. Training new workers takes time, but training commitment takes longer. Commitment cannot be forced, it grows when people believe their effort matters. Without that belief, systems operate at minimum capacity. The longer this continues, the more normalized disengagement becomes. Young men entering adulthood see withdrawal as reasonable rather than radical. They plan accordingly. They build lives that do not depend on institutional promises. This creates generational divergence. Older models of success lose relevance. New models prioritize autonomy, flexibility, and self containment. This is not rebellion, it is evolution. Societies evolve when incentives change. Culture follows economics, not the other way around. When economic participation becomes risky without reward, culture adapts to minimize exposure. This is what we are witnessing. Attempts to reverse this trend through messaging alone will fail. Trust cannot be rebuilt with slogans. Respect cannot be mandated. Reciprocity cannot be assumed. Only consistent action changes perception. If environments become genuinely fair, participation may increase. If not, disengagement will stabilize as the new normal. Men are not waiting to be convinced. They are watching outcomes. Every policy, every social shift, every institutional response sends a signal. Men interpret these signals pragmatically. They adjust behavior accordingly. So far, the signals have reinforced withdrawal rather than return. This is why the conversation feels stalled. One side speaks in ideals, the other responds in behavior. Behavior always wins. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone trying to make sense of current social tension. It explains why appeals to emotion fail. It explains why participation does not rebound. It explains why silence spreads. Silence is not emptiness, it is a decision. Men walking away are not disappearing from the world. They are disengaging from roles that no longer serve them. They are choosing lives that minimize risk and maximize peace. That choice, multiplied millions of times, reshapes society more powerfully than any movement ever could. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. As disengagement becomes normalized, another layer of the issue emerges that is rarely discussed honestly. Social systems were never designed to function when large numbers of men decide to operate independently of them. These systems assume participation, compliance, and contribution as default settings. When those defaults change, the systems do not adapt gracefully. They begin to fracture. This fracture appears first in subtle ways. Service quality declines, timelines extend, costs rise, accountability becomes harder to enforce because there are fewer people willing to absorb responsibility. Over time, these small inefficiencies accumulate until they become visible failures. At that point, the narrative shifts from denial to confusion. The confusion stems from a mistaken belief that participation can be commanded. Participation is not a switch that can be flipped. It is a relationship that must be maintained. When that relationship breaks down, restoring it requires more than incentives or pressure. It requires acknowledgement of why trust eroded in the first place. For many men, that acknowledgement has never arrived. Instead, the dominant response has been reframing. Men are told they are disengaging because they are struggling emotionally, because they fear competition, or because they lack direction. These explanations are comforting because they imply the solution lies within men themselves. If men are the problem, systems are absolved. But observable behavior contradicts this narrative. Men are not chaotic, they are not directionless, they are not confused. They are making deliberate choices that reduce exposure to risk and increase personal stability. That is not weakness, that is adaptation. Adaptation becomes especially visible in how men approach work. Employment is no longer viewed as identity, it is viewed as a transaction. Time is exchanged for compensation, nothing more. Loyalty disappears when loyalty is not rewarded. Extra effort disappears when extra effort increases liability rather than opportunity. This transactional mindset is not cynical. It is pragmatic. It reflects a recalibration of expectations after repeated disappointments. Men learned that promises of advancement, fulfillment, and belonging often dissolved when tested by reality. As a result, men now design their lives to be resilient even if institutions fail. They diversify income when possible. They limit debt. They avoid entanglements that could destabilize them financially or legally. They choose predictability over prestige. This is why many men appear detached from cultural panic. Panic assumes dependence. Detachment emerges when dependence is reduced. The shift also exposes an uncomfortable truth about modern relationships. Many relationships were sustained not by mutual investment, but by asymmetric obligation. Men were expected to absorb uncertainty so others could feel secure. When men withdrew from that role, the imbalance became obvious. This does not mean relationships cannot be healthy or cooperative. It means those relationships must be negotiated honestly rather than assumed automatically. Automatic obligation is what collapsed. Men realized that obligation without consent is not partnership, it is extraction. Once that realization sets in, behavior changes permanently. People do not return willingly to arrangements they recognize as unbalanced. They either renegotiate or walk away. Most men chose to walk away because renegotiation was not welcome. This withdrawal also changes how men perceive time. Time becomes precious when it is no longer traded for approval. Men guard their schedules carefully. They invest time in activities that deliver tangible returns, whether that return is skill, health, or peace. Social engagement becomes selective. Entertainment becomes functional rather than immersive. Information consumption becomes filtered. Men stop arguing with narratives they cannot influence and focus on realities they can control. This inward turn is often misinterpreted as disengagement from society itself. It is not disengagement from society, it is disengagement from noise. Noise thrives on emotional reaction, withdrawal starves it. This is why attempts to provoke response increasingly fail. Outrage fatigue sets in when people realize outrage rarely produces change. Men conserve emotional energy because emotional energy was exploited. Instead of reacting, they observe. Instead of protesting, they adjust. Instead of demanding reform, they build parallel lives. Parallel lives do not require permission. As more men adopt this approach, social cohesion weakens not through conflict, but through absence. Absence is difficult to address because it does not present a clear opponent. There is nothing to argue against, there is simply less participation. This absence forces institutions to confront a difficult question. What happens when people no longer believe the system serves them? So far, the response has been to double down on control rather than rebuild trust. Control is easier than humility. Control offers immediate leverage. Trust requires long term consistency. But control accelerates disengagement. When people feel coerced, they retreat further. When flexibility disappears, resistance increases quietly. Men recognize this pattern. They have already lived through environments where compliance was demanded without reciprocity. They will not repeat that experience voluntarily. Another factor reinforcing withdrawal is the visibility of consequences. Men can now see outcomes of different life paths in real time. Information is abundant. Patterns are visible. Decisions are no longer made blindly. When men see others reduce stress by opting out, the lesson spreads. When they see others punished for compliance, caution spreads faster. This is how cultural shifts propagate, not through persuasion, but through observation. Observation teaches faster than instruction. Men observe that independence buffers against volatility. They observe that minimalism increases flexibility. They observe that expectations create vulnerability. These observations shape behavior more effectively than any narrative. This also explains why messaging focused on shame fails. Shame assumes dependency on social approval. Men who have detached from approval are immune to it. You cannot shame someone who does not seek validation. This immunity frustrates institutions accustomed to using moral pressure as leverage. When that leverage disappears, they resort to increasingly abstract arguments that resonate with fewer people. The disconnect widens. Meanwhile, economic reality continues to apply pressure unevenly. Rising costs force prioritization. Men prioritize survival and stability. Women, facing delayed adjustment, experience sharper stress as old assumptions collapse faster than new strategies form. This difference in timing fuels misunderstanding. Men appear indifferent, women appear distressed. Neither fully understands the other because their adaptation curves are offset. But adaptation is happening regardless. The longer this divergence persists, the more entrenched it becomes. People build lives around their chosen strategies. Reversal becomes unlikely because reversal would require abandoning stability for uncertainty. Men will not abandon stability without compelling reason. Compelling reason does not come from guilt, it comes from opportunity. Opportunity requires fairness, respect, and reciprocity. Without those elements, withdrawal remains the rational choice. This reality challenges deeply held beliefs about social responsibility. Responsibility cannot exist without agency. Agency cannot exist without trust. Trust cannot exist without fairness. Remove any one of these elements, and the structure collapses. Men walking away did not create this collapse, they revealed it. They exposed how much depended on their unacknowledged labor and emotional restraint. They demonstrated that systems functioned not because they were fair, but because people tolerated unfairness. Tolerance has limits. Once those limits are reached, behavior changes quietly but decisively. This is why the shift feels sudden to observers, but gradual to participants. Men experienced years of accumulation before acting. Outsiders only noticed when thresholds were crossed. Thresholds have now been crossed in multiple domains: labor shortages, declining engagement, social fragmentation, economic strain. These are not isolated phenomena. They are interconnected outcomes of disengagement. Addressing them requires addressing root causes, not symptoms. Root causes include uneven accountability, cultural hostility, and the erosion of trust. Without confronting these honestly, no amount of policy adjustment will restore participation. Men are not interested in returning to environments that punish them for existing. They are not interested in absorbing risk without reward. They are not interested in narratives that deny their lived experience. They have learned to rely on themselves instead. This self reliance is not antisocial, it is self protective. As self protection becomes widespread, society becomes less cooperative by default. Cooperation must then be earned rather than assumed. Earning cooperation takes time, humility, and consistency. It requires acknowledging mistakes without defensiveness. It requires redesigning systems with balanced incentives. So far, that work has barely begun. And until it does, disengagement will continue at a steady pace. Men will refine minimalist lifestyles. They will optimize for peace. They will invest in autonomy. And society will continue adjusting to their absence, whether it understands the reason or not. This is the reality of a world where consent matters and participation is optional. The silence is not confusion, it is clarity. As this pattern settles in, a deeper structural consequence begins to surface, one that is less emotional and more mechanical. Modern societies are highly specialized. They rely on predictable participation from millions of individuals who perform roles that are not glamorous but are essential. When participation declines in these areas, the effects are not immediately catastrophic, but they are cumulative. Maintenance is delayed. Infrastructure ages faster than it is repaired. Training pipelines thin out. Institutional knowledge disappears as experienced workers leave without replacements. Over time, resilience declines because systems are designed to operate near capacity, not with large gaps. Men historically filled many of these stabilizing roles not because of ideology, but because incentives aligned that way. When incentives changed, participation changed with them. The system did not adjust because it assumed the old behavior would persist indefinitely. This assumption was a mistake. What makes the situation difficult to correct is that the withdrawal is not coordinated. There is no central point of negotiation. There is no single demand. There is only a shared conclusion reached independently by millions of individuals. When disengagement is decentralized, it becomes resistant to intervention. Policymakers often respond by attempting to restore old participation patterns through external pressure, but pressure without legitimacy accelerates resistance. People do not respond positively to being told they must care more about systems that failed them. Legitimacy is earned when systems demonstrate fairness over time. It cannot be announced, it must be observed. Men learn to evaluate legitimacy by outcomes rather than promises. When outcomes consistently contradicted rhetoric, credibility collapsed. This collapse did not lead to chaos, it led to reorientation. Men stopped expecting systems to provide meaning. They stopped seeking identity through roles that could be revoked without warning. They stopped assuming effort guaranteed stability. Instead, they focused on what they could control: health, skills, finances, time. This shift toward internal stability is often mischaracterized as selfishness. In reality, it is a response to volatility. When external structures become unreliable, people anchor inward. Anchoring inward changes behavior permanently. Once men experienced the benefits of reduced exposure, they became less willing to reintroduce stressors. They recognized how much of their previous effort went toward maintaining appearances rather than improving outcomes. Appearances lost value. This is why many men now appear indifferent to status markers that once drove competition: titles, recognition, and symbolic authority matter less when they do not translate into security or respect. Men are no longer impressed by narratives, they are impressed by consistency. Consistency means rules that apply equally, expectations that are reciprocal, consequences that are predictable. Without these elements, engagement remains optional. Another consequence of disengagement is the redistribution of risk. When men step back from absorbing risk, that risk does not disappear. It spreads outward. Institutions feel it. Communities feel it. Individuals feel it. This redistribution creates friction because it exposes dependencies that were previously invisible. When support is assumed, it is not appreciated. When it is removed, its absence becomes obvious. This is not punishment, it is reality asserting itself. Men are no longer buffering society from the consequences of its own decisions. They are no longer absorbing losses quietly. They are allowing systems to experience feedback directly. Feedback is uncomfortable, but it is necessary for correction, and without feedback, systems drift. The feedback loop is now active and it is forcing adaptation, whether institutions want it or not. Economic pressure accelerates this process. Rising costs reduce tolerance for inefficiency. People become less willing to subsidize dysfunction through personal sacrifice. Men respond by tightening boundaries. They reduce commitments. They avoid long term obligations that depend on unstable assumptions. This boundary tightening is not antagonistic, it is preventative. Preventative behavior is often misunderstood because it does not announce itself. It simply avoids. Avoidance changes the social landscape gradually. Participation drops. Engagement thins. Expectations adjust downward. Eventually, the absence becomes normalized. Normalization is critical because once behavior becomes normal, reversing it requires extraordinary incentives. Ordinary appeals no longer work. Men are not hostile, they are uninterested. Uninterest is more powerful than opposition because it does not engage. This disengagement also reshapes communication. Men communicate less publicly and more privately. They avoid performative spaces. They prefer environments with clear rules and minimal ambiguity. Ambiguity is risk. In ambiguous environments, interpretation matters more than intention. Men learned that interpretation could be weaponized. They responded by reducing exposure. This is why many men gravitate toward solitude or structured activities where expectations are explicit. Clear rules reduce risk. Predictability increases comfort. Social environments that thrive on ambiguity lose appeal. This does not mean men reject social connection. It means they seek connection on their own terms, connection without pressure, interaction without obligation, cooperation without extraction. These conditions are rare in large systems, but common in small, controlled settings. As a result, social life fragments. Smaller circles replace broad participation. Private networks replace public ones. Informal arrangements replace formal commitments. This fragmentation weakens centralized authority but strengthens individual resilience. Resilient individuals are harder to mobilize en masse. They do not respond to fear based messaging because their lives are not tightly coupled to system performance. Decoupling is the defining feature of this era. Men are decoupling from institutions, narratives, and expectations that no longer serve them. They are coupling themselves more tightly to personal routines and controllable outcomes. This decoupling reduces volatility at the individual level while increasing it at the systemic level. Systems built on interdependence struggle when participants become independent. Independence is often portrayed as isolation. It is not, it is optional participation. Optional participation changes power dynamics. When participation is optional, systems must compete for engagement. They must offer value rather than demand compliance. This is the shift many institutions are unprepared for. They are accustomed to moral authority rather than market dynamics. They expect loyalty rather than evaluation. Men now evaluate. Evaluation is unemotional, it is practical. It asks simple questions. What does this cost? What does this return? What happens if it fails? When answers are unsatisfactory, participation declines. This evaluation extends to every domain: work, relationships, community, media. Nothing is exempt. This is why disengagement appears widespread rather than localized. The same logic applies everywhere. Men are not rejecting society, they are rejecting unfavorable contracts. A favorable contract includes fairness, respect, and mutual benefit. Without those elements, the contract is void. This realization spreads quietly because it does not require coordination. It only requires observation. Observation is enough. As more men observe similar outcomes, confidence in withdrawal increases. The fear of missing out diminishes when others demonstrate contentment with less. Contentment is contagious. Contentment undermines control mechanisms that rely on dissatisfaction. If people are satisfied with minimal arrangements, they are less susceptible to pressure. This creates a paradox for systems that depend on aspiration to drive participation. When aspiration fades, motivation shifts inward. Inward motivation is difficult to harness for collective goals. This is why appeals to collective duty struggle. They assume shared priorities that no longer exist. Men prioritize stability over ambition. They prioritize peace over recognition. They prioritize autonomy over belonging. These priorities are rational responses to volatility. As volatility persists, these priorities harden. Hardening priorities makes reversal unlikely. Reversal would require not only improving conditions, but convincing men that improvements will last. Trust, once broken, is cautious to return. Men are not pessimistic, they are conservative with risk. Risk aversion increases after repeated losses. Losses need not be dramatic to matter, they only need to be consistent. Consistency shaped this shift. Years of small disappointments accumulated until tolerance was exhausted. Withdrawal was the logical conclusion. Now the question becomes whether systems can adapt to a world where participation is earned rather than assumed. Adaptation is possible, but it requires humility. Humility requires acknowledging that disengagement was a response, not a cause. So far, acknowledgement has been limited. Until that changes, disengagement will remain stable. Men will continue to build lives that function independently. They will continue to reduce exposure. They will continue to choose predictability. This does not mean society collapses overnight. It means society becomes leaner, quieter, and less forgiving of inefficiency. Those who adapt will manage. Those who cling to old assumptions will struggle. This is not punishment, it is adjustment. Adjustment is the natural outcome of prolonged imbalance. Men walking away did not invent imbalance, they responded to it. The response was calm, deliberate, and irreversible for many. And as this response becomes the default rather than the exception, the world must adapt to men who no longer need permission to live differently. They already are. As this reality settles in, one final misconception needs to be addressed clearly and without emotion. This shift is not driven by resentment, hostility, or a desire for revenge. Those interpretations are convenient because they allow observers to dismiss the behavior rather than understand it. What is happening is far simpler and far more permanent. Men made a rational assessment of their environment and adjusted accordingly. Adjustment is not rebellion, adjustment is survival. For a long time, society benefited from men absorbing pressure quietly. Men worked longer hours, they accepted unstable arrangements, they tolerated disrespect because they were told it was necessary, noble, or temporary. Over time, it became clear that temporary conditions had become permanent expectations. That realization changed everything. Once men recognized that sacrifice was no longer reciprocal, the emotional contract dissolved. Without that contract, participation lost its moral weight. What remained was a practical decision: continue investing energy into systems that offered declining returns, or redirect that energy inward towards stability and peace. Millions chose the second option. This choice reshaped priorities in a way that cannot be easily reversed. Men no longer measure success by approval or visibility. They measure success by autonomy, predictability, and control over their own lives. These metrics do not align with traditional social incentives, which is why so many systems feel out of sync. When people stop chasing validation, narratives lose power. This is why attempts to reframe disengagement as a crisis continue to miss the mark. Crisis implies urgency and distress. What many men feel instead is calm. Calm does not mobilize easily. Calm does not respond to fear. Calm is content to remain still. This calm frustrates systems built on constant motion. Economic models assume perpetual growth. Cultural models assume perpetual participation. Social models assume perpetual availability. When men remove themselves from these assumptions, friction appears everywhere. Yet friction is not collapse, it is recalibration. Recalibration forces hard questions. Who carries responsibility when participation becomes optional? What happens when contribution requires consent? How do systems function when fairness becomes a prerequisite rather than a suggestion? These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge long-standing power dynamics. For decades, men were treated as an infinite resource. Their time, labor, and emotional restraint were assumed rather than acknowledged. Infinite resources invite inefficiency. Once limits are enforced, inefficiency becomes visible. Men enforce limits by leaving quietly. The silence that followed is not emptiness, it is feedback. Feedback reveals which systems were sustainable and which were dependent on silent sacrifice. The systems now under strain are the ones that relied most heavily on unreciprocated contribution. This realization creates a crossroads. One path involves denial: blame men for disengaging, pathologize withdrawal, redefine non participation as failure. This path preserves narratives but accelerates decline. The other path involves adaptation: acknowledge mistakes, restore fairness, rebuild trust through consistent action rather than words. This path is slower and more difficult, but it offers a chance at renewal. So far, most institutions have chosen the first path because it is easier. Men see this choice clearly. That is why disengagement continues. Men do not need to protest. They do not need to organize. They do not need to argue. Their absence communicates everything necessary. Absence is the ultimate boundary. As this boundary holds, society will continue adjusting to reduce participation. Some industries will contract, others will adapt. New models will emerge that align better with current incentives. Men will participate where conditions make sense. They will withdraw where they do not. This selective engagement becomes the new norm. This norm reshapes relationships as well. Relationships built on expectation rather than cooperation struggle. Relationships built on reciprocity endure. Men are no longer willing to subsidize imbalance. This does not mean connection disappears. It becomes intentional. It becomes conditional. It becomes honest. Honesty replaces obligation. This honesty is uncomfortable because it removes illusions. Illusions once smoothed over imbalance. Without them, reality feels sharper. But clarity is healthier than illusion. Men learned this through experience. They learned that pretending things were fine did not make them fine. They learned that silence preserved peace better than confrontation. They learned that walking away was sometimes the only form of self respect available. These lessons are now embedded deeply. Reversing them would require proving that conditions have fundamentally changed. Not promised, not announced, proven. Proof takes time. Until proof exists, men will continue living scaled down lives that prioritize peace over participation. They will continue reducing exposure to systems that demand more than they give. They will continue trusting observable reality over rhetoric. This is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. Pattern recognition improves with experience. Men have accumulated enough experience to see patterns clearly. That clarity is why this movement does not burn hot and fade out. It cools and solidifies. It becomes stable. It becomes boring. And boring movements are the hardest to stop because there is nothing to argue with. There is only choice. As society moves forward, the consequences of this choice will continue unfolding. Labor shortages will persist. Social expectations will shift. Economic models will adjust slowly and unevenly. Some people will adapt early. Others will struggle longer. None of this is personal. It is structural. Structures change when incentives change. Men responded to changed incentives by changing behavior. That response is rational, consistent, and repeatable. It will not reverse on its own. If there is a lesson here, it is this: participation is earned, trust is built, respect is reciprocal. When any of these elements are removed, disengagement is inevitable. Men walking away are not rejecting society, they are rejecting unfair terms. They are choosing lives that function without permission. They are choosing peace over pressure, but they are choosing autonomy over obligation. They are choosing reality over narrative. As long as those choices continue delivering better outcomes than the alternatives, they will persist. This is the world as it is now. Understanding it matters more than arguing about it. Adaptation matters more than blame. Clarity matters more than comfort. And whether society adjusts successfully depends on whether it can accept a simple truth. Men are no longer willing to be silent participants in systems that do not value them. They have already moved on. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with the observations or do you see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation is bigger than any one video. And as always, like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, Men Walking Away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.